All right, so I've got Dr. Tommy Wood coming back on the channel again. All right, this time, what did you have for dinner last night? Because I already asked you breakfast.
Last night, I ate a beautiful 3-pound tomahawk ribeye.
Anything else? Just that?
I mean, I was out to dinner with some friends, so I think I ate some vegetables maybe on the side. But obviously, the main event was the ribeye.
So
I think I had some asparagus, maybe some cauliflower. Yeah.
3 pounds, like including the bone, or just 3 pounds?
It includes the bone, so
it
was probably like 2 and a bit pounds of meat. But then, you know, obviously, as you'd expect, I'm there like in this fancy steak restaurant with like the bone in my mouth, like chewing all the bits off it. So.
That's what I usually say when you go out to eat. It's like when in doubt, just lean into the protein, because it's just. Whether you someone that eats carbs or not, like the carbs at restaurants are what's going to get you in trouble, because they're usually just marinated in tons of oil. They're usually, it's just like, just go for the protein. You can never go wrong. But
yeah.
All right. Well, just in case people haven't watched the other videos, like Tommy, can you give just a brief 30-second commercial on who you are?
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington. I do many different things related to the brain. First, I run a basic neuroscience lab, so I look at ways to treat the injured brain. And then I also work with various populations either at risk for brain injury, so athletes, special forces operators at risk of traumatic brain injury, and then also populations at risk of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, and trying to sort of create this scope of how do we make the brain and body function as well as possible for as long as possible.
Awesome. And that's kind of how we connected. We both have done some work with special forces operators, more so on the kind of performance and nutrition side, and I think you much more on the cognitive side. So that's how we got connected, through a mutual friend that shall remain nameless, but he's a mystery, and if you know him, you know him. So that's just who it is. So today, we joke about this all the time. But anyway, today we want to focus on sort of the effects of fasting when it comes down to having a stimulus. And there's this common misconception out there that food and nutrients are what stimulate sort of repair or growth. And I think to some degree, it probably plays a role. But we had a discussion about a week ago, and you said something that was very enlightening. You said it's actually, demand is what stimulates this repair or this growth. And when it comes down to building muscle, when it comes down to fasting, this can definitely apply. And we were, so I kind of want to let you sort of describe this, because you mentioned to me that exercise and moving when you're fasting is one of the most important things. And can you kind of explain why?
Yeah, I think there's 2 broad reasons for that. The first we touched upon briefly in the first video, which basically says that during extended fasts, you reduce the insulin sensitivity of some of the peripheral tissues, largely to spare glucose for the brain. And that's not a problem at all, because you have alternative fuel sources, fatty acids, ketones during the fast. But if then, I see a lot on social media, hey, we're going to do a 3-day or a 7-day fast before Thanksgiving because we know we're going to have this big blowout at Thanksgiving. And that is like the worst thing I think you could possibly do, because you've created this systemic insulin resistance during the fast, and then you just like throw a bunch of refined carbohydrates on top of that. It's going to be massive spikes in blood sugar, all this kind of stuff, which is, if you're thinking about fasting, is probably something that you want to avoid. However, you can offset some of that through exercise. And we know that insulin sensitivity in the muscle tissue is like this demand-driven process. So if you do some kind of exercise, you'll maintain that insulin sensitivity in the muscle tissue during the fast. And I think that does kind of make sense to me on a number of levels, because evolutionarily, if we were fasting, we were probably moving because we were looking for the food to end that fast, right? So I believe that it makes sense for there to be this sort of link between extended fast and movement, because they probably came together in general. The other side of that is that when we think about growth and repair, and they kind of come together, right? First, you might stimulate some repair, and then that leads to later growth, sort of like autophagy first, and then growth. And that's really driven by demand. It's driven by you putting stress on those tissues, and it could be the muscles, it could be the brain. We see it almost identical processes happening in both. And the way I kind of think about it, you can drink all the protein shakes you want and take all the steroids you want, but you're never going to look like Ronnie Coleman unless you actually go and do 800-pound squats or whatever the guy did, right? So like, it should make sense that demand is critical. But during a fast, you are going to be redistributing tissues in order to provide your body with energy. And if there are tissues that you want to keep around, such as your muscle tissue, you have to keep creating the demand to keep saying, this is an important tissue that I want to keep. And also in that process, you'll maybe draw energy from other tissues that you don't want. And then those can be used to support muscle tissue. So if you're fasting for extended periods of time, and we see the same thing, there's huge bodies of literature on bed rest. If you are stuck in bed for a long period of time, your muscles start to waste away, and you can prevent that. And usually because, you have some kind of chronic inflammatory process, some disease process, or a muscle you've broken a bone or something. If you continue to stimulate, so you're usually in some kind of caloric deficit, right? For any of those processes, or you've reduced your demand, you're not moving, you're less hungry, you eat less. That's very common as well. But if you stimulate those tissues, and there are multiple ways to do that, you can maintain that muscle. So for multiple reasons, if you're fasting for long periods of time, giving stimulus to the muscles is going to be critical in terms of, then keeping those muscles as you start to use up tissues for energy, which is going to happen naturally during a fast.
So with that, do you think it's plausible to actually build muscle in a deficit at that rate? So
there's quite a lot of literature that suggests that with adequate, so you probably need some, so if you were fasting completely, I think it's unlikely you're going to build tons of muscle tissue. However, if you have adequate energy on board, and that can just be adipose tissue, say, and you have adequate protein, and probably more protein, the level of protein probably does matter, but and you have adequate stimulus, you can, there's like a famous paper by Longland where they do this, they put people in a significant caloric deficit with, I think it's 1.6 grams per kilo of protein in the high protein group, and a pretty intense exercise regimen. I think they were exercising every day, like 12,000 steps. There was some circuit training, some resistance training, maybe some aerobic training as well. So training pretty hard, significant deficit, with adequate protein, and they saw pretty impressive body recomposition, including loss of body fat and muscle gain, despite being in a caloric deficit. So it definitely sort of from the applied literature seems to be possible.
Interesting. So, but it's not necessarily saying that, okay, if someone is doing an 18 or a 20-hour fast and they work out during that period of time, if there's not adequate fuel post-fast, it's unlikely that they're going to build muscle from that.
Yeah, I mean, we know pretty well that the most, in terms of like nutrient availability, the most important thing for growing muscle tissue after, say, a resistance training session is the protein availability in like the 24 hours afterwards. So if you had no protein available at all, yes, you might get a little bit from proteolysis in other tissues that you didn't work, but it's probably going to be enough to get significant muscle protein synthesis. So you will, to get significant muscle growth, you will then need the input of some additional protein.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's what we generally say on this channel is, okay, depending on the length of the fast, I mean, if it's a 16-hour fast, people get upset when I say this, but I don't really consider a 16-hour fast much of a fast. Like I don't, like not much is really, really happening at that point to really drive a whole lot of serious change. I mean, like most of the benefit that comes from there is people are being put in a box and possibly just consuming less calories in their eating window. And maybe they just feel better, and there's all kinds of different reasons there. So I'm not discounting it. And when you're looking at being able to train in a fasted state, I do think that you're potentially demanding a little bit more than maybe training in a fed state, because it's such this state, as you mentioned, it's almost evolutionarily advantageous because it's like this ideal time. And maybe there's other pieces that we're not looking at, right? Like, okay, this is an ideal time because the body is maybe accustomed to this. A lot of times I suggest, okay, if you're fasting and you're very insulin sensitive because you've been fasting for 18 or 20 hours, it might not be a bad idea to do some strength training towards the end of that workout and then have your post-workout meal be your break fast meal, because then you're hypothetically getting a double whammy effect, right? Maybe you're insulin sensitive from your workout and you're insulin sensitive from the end of your fast, and you might be able to get away with a little bit more carbohydrates and be able to kind of scoot by with that and possibly get some benefit. But I put a link down below for Thrive Market if you're trying to find maybe lower carb snacks or things like that. Figured it'd be helpful to put a link down below. Thrive Market's an online membership-based grocery store. They are a sponsor on this channel, so I throw them a bone whenever I can. So that link is down below. You'll save 30% off your full grocery order. So they have keto snacks, they have paleo snacks, whatever. I don't think snacks are the end of the world. I just think we need to have them at the right place, right? So 30% off your entire grocery order, but also a $50 free gift when you do use that link down below. So if you're looking for different foods that you want to kind of add to your arsenal, you want to just experiment, or you're just looking for a better way to get groceries than going to the grocery store, use them down below. Check that link out. What do you know much about the world of aerobic exercise during a fast? Is it much different from the resistance training as far as catabolism is concerned and potential muscle wasting? Because this is a constant argument that I see come up is, okay, resistance training, albeit at a relatively low sort of aerobic intensity, maybe just resistance training with adequate rests in between and really just kind of sitting in that typical hypertrophic range, compared to maybe just going for a run. I'm going to put you on the spot for a second and ask you to pick one that you would think is better for someone that's maybe 18 hours into a fast. And this is, no one's going to like hold you to this 100%, but I'm very curious what you think on the spot with that.
Better for what?
It's a good question. Body composition.
Yeah, that is a good question. I would pick resistance training.
Yeah, as would I. Yeah. I mean, as would I, and obviously for the reasons that you mentioned. And usually, what I would suggest is say, okay, on the days that you're not doing your fast, that might be a great day for you to be doing a little bit more of your cardio work. And what's your reasoning behind that? Is it simply because of the evolutionary response that we talked about, or more so just the potential catabolic effects of aerobic exercise?
Yeah. So I think again, in reality, when we talk about these things, so much of it is hypothetical because we really don't know. Like nobody's taken the time, or probably will ever take the time, to really understand these in an applied sense in a large enough in a diverse enough population to really understand what's going on. So if you're trying to drive some specific adaptation, whatever reason it is that you're trying to drive that. So if you're trying to drive, maybe a significant deficit, you're doing an extended period of, several days of fasting, and you want to like maximally sort of stimulate some of those autophagic pathways or other things, which is possible. I can't tell you that this wouldn't happen because we don't know. Then maybe aerobic exercise is the thing to do. If for whatever reason that's the stimulus that you're trying to drive. But if your ultimate goal is to maximize body composition or to improve body composition, then giving an adequate stimulus to those muscles, in terms of muscle growth, obviously resistance training is going to be a more important stimulus there. And then you'll also, then you'll get a benefit from that as you then add nutrients back into the system later.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And you seem like someone that would be a good person to discuss kind of the whole non-exercise activity thermogenesis piece with exercise or with just movement as far as time during a fast. This is something that is talked about just in general caloric restriction a lot in terms of the fitness community, and people seem to kind of sound like experts with it, but I don't know if there's a lot of fact with what they're saying, right? It's okay if you reduce calories, the moment that you're in a deficit, your NEAT decreases, you're not moving as much, you're not fidgeting as much and things like that. This is one of those things where, okay, if you're exercising during a fast, that's a very deliberate thing, okay? but there's also a very strong degree of non-exercise activity thermogenesis that is down when you're fasting. Obviously, you're not fidgeting, you're not moving as much. Do you notice much of this, and how much does this play a role with fasting, do you think, as far as body composition, as far as potential really turning down the need for calories? I mean, do you think it's something that people need to be worried about, or do you think it's not that big of a deal?
I don't think, I mean, I obviously very much believe in like the constrained energy model. And so if you know, in order there will be some matching of calorie availability to, you know, these sort of subconscious or unconscious movements, these so maybe not neat in terms of like going for a walk, but, you know, the fidgeting and all these other kinds of things, or maybe even the motivation to get up and do something which you would have done if you were sort of in eucaloric. And so I'm sure that does happen, right? We know, you know, body temperature may drop slightly, you know, those movements may drop slightly in order to sort of decrease total calorie demands. And then, I mean, you will obviously overcome some of that with conscious movement or conscious exercise. In reality, if you're fasted, I mean, that's a big fat deficit, which you can't sort of like completely compensate by not moving. So I think just like the fact that you're fasted, for whatever reason it is that you're fasting, I don't then worry that you have to automatically think about moving all day in order to overcome. I think there'll be a spontaneous decrease in NEAT. That makes perfect sense. I don't think you need to worry about that.
Yeah. So at that rate, if someone was fasted and bedridden compared to maybe consuming 500 calories bedridden, I mean, it does just become down to a simple thermodynamic equation that someone that's the less you eat alongside not moving, equally matched not moving, you're going to lose more muscle, you're going to waste more, right? I mean, that's, yeah. So in a lot of ways, that kind of answered the dimmer switch question, which is, this is a great video to kind of discuss that. Besides just general weight loss, besides just, okay, you're going to lose more weight if you're in a larger deficit, do you believe that the benefits of a deficit are a dimmer switch or they are a light switch? Like once AMPK is phosphorylated, what this is happening, and once you're kind of going down that, is the switch on and the benefits are just happening, or does it get more and more better, for lack of a better term, when you're in a fast, when you're not eating at all?
So I don't think anything in biology is a light switch. Pretty much, like nothing happens in a pure on-off manner. There's no biological process where I could think of that's the case. What I would think about it as is a dimmer switch where you can never reach all the way the top or all the way at the bottom. Like the resistance, resistance gets harder and harder and harder the more you push it, and you can never quite go all the way. And that happens in both directions, because I think you're always going to reach this sort of like whatever the process is, you're going to reach like an asymptote at the top, and you're going to get some kind of feedback that stops it changing anymore. And that's going to happen at both ends of the process. So I would see it as a dimmer, but the more you move it, the harder it gets to continue to move it.
Interesting. Okay. So with that, kind of talking about like a dimmer switch never really reaching the end, it kind of dovetails into the idea of hormesis. There's a lot of this talk going around now. It's interesting, like just the way the internet works, right? Just now you've been preaching ancestral, and now I think there's this, people get so loud about that you start seeing opposition to that, and it starts raising all kinds of different discussions, which are just interesting. It's kind of the beauty, but also the curse of it, because it's just, everything just gets consolidated and information is generally incorrect. But it kind of begs this question, is hormesis really necessary? Is a hormetic stressor really necessary in that case? Or like, the whole what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Could it actually be what doesn't kill you kills you slowly over time? And what's your take with that? Because as someone that is a big intermittent faster, someone that fasts a lot, and now I've kind of changed from my perspective of, hey, intermittent fasting relatively frequently to doing much more moderate to extended length fasts semi-regularly. Maybe I'll do a 24-hour fast twice a week or once a week or something like that. But because I ask myself that question, it's like, at what line, do you still feel like a hormetic stressor outside of, say, resistance stress training, things like that, is necessary, or is it actually detrimental over time?
So I I generally believe that you can have too much of a good thing, but I think that like it's difficult to call it a stress because we've created this sort of like around the word stress is like it's like all these negative connotations. So maybe there would be a better word for it than stressor, but I don't think of them as stressors. I think of them as essential biologic inputs, and the body expects movement, right? Because it regulates all of these, a number of processes from like cardiovascular function to metabolic health, insulin sensitivity, cognitive function, right? We've talked about how exercise drives tissue autophagy, repair, stimulates growth. Like movement is just like it's an essential input into the system. And I think that in general, timing of meals are probably part of that as well. And I think that, there are other things that we talk about, hot and cold and light and dark. There are these kind of expected inputs that seem to regulate the system. And it's the lack of inputs that are probably a problem. But you can take it too far, right? You can fast too much. You can exercise too much. You can spend too long in hot or in cold. And I don't think everybody needs to do hot, and I don't think everybody or cold, and I don't think everybody needs to fast. But I do think everybody needs to move. And so we know we get these beneficial adaptations from these quote unquote stressors, but I think it's because they're expected inputs rather than because we're benefiting from stress or hormesis. I think the absence of them, and we see this particularly with exercise, so I think that's the best example. The absence of exercise is pro-inflammatory, right? So being sedentary is a pathologic state, right? It's associated with all these, negative pathways, negative pathologic pathways. So I think it's because, so the absence of this thing is what's the problem, not that adding it is a beneficial stressor. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And it also depends on kind of our perception of the stressor, right? If we were, Men in Black came right now and did their little thingy on us and told us that, sitting down on the couch was a stressor, and we believed that was a stressor, right? Would we say, okay, we need to intermittently be sedentary, like just because it's a stressor? It all depends on how we perceive things, right? So then, and there's this very fine line between what is our brain telling us in what is actually happening and how we perceive it and how we kind of draw that conclusion there. Back to fasting and exercise and muscle building. I mean, if you had to give tips, maybe let's say like 2 or 3 actionable tips for people that are trying to maintain or build muscle, but they really just like the idea of fasting. They're not embarking on fasting because, hey, this is the way to build muscle, but it's a lifestyle that works for them. It's a strategy that works for them. What would you suggest for people that are trying to build muscle with intermittent fasting?
So, I mean, the basics are always going to be important, and I don't think that changes here. So, if you do intermittent fasting, so I guess it depends on the length, right? If your fast is less than 24 hours or up to 24 hours, whether or not you exercise on that day or do resistance training on a day may not matter that much. During prolonged fast, I think resistance training during the fast is important. And then what are the other important things for gaining muscle mass? Adequate calorie intake, especially protein intake. And so you're probably talking 1.6, 1.8, maybe 2 grams per kilo of target body weight, if you want to get super specific. So adequate stimulus, and then adequate protein, like we talked about earlier. And so again, the important thing is this stuff integrates over time. So don't think that it has to be perfect on the day that you fast. This just has to happen regularly. You have to be getting in your at least 4 sets to close to voluntary failure per muscle group per week, right? That's probably like the minimum effective dose of resistance training in order to build muscle. So you have to be achieving that per week. How that happens around your fast probably doesn't matter that much. And then again, total protein integrated over time is going to be important. If you wanted to maximize muscle mass, I don't think fasting is necessarily going to help you get there better, but I'm sure you can definitely integrate them together. From the applied literature, when you're in a deficit, which you will be, at least intermittently, if you're intermittent fasting, then the stimulus seems to be more important than the protein. I used to think that if you're going to be in a deficit, you need to like dramatically increase your protein intake, like 2.2 or 2.4 grams per kilo, but I don't think that's true. I think we have enough evidence to just suggest that as long as you're getting adequate protein, those levels I mentioned earlier, it's the stimulus that really matters when you're in a deficit to either maintain or build muscle tissue.
I think that's a very key point there. The stimulus matters the most, because I think the concern that people have is, okay, if I am in a consolidated eating window, there's simply not enough period of time for me to get adequate amount of protein. And that's a viable concern. Do you feel like if someone has a compressed eating window of maybe only 6 hours, or let's just even hypothetically say 4 hours, do you think it's possible to get enough protein in there, considering that they don't need to necessarily increase their protein because they're in a deficit, or maybe they're in a deficit because the stimulus was there. And as long as they're maybe getting enough protein over the following 48 hours, because I think the literature now is showing it sort of peaks around like 24, 26 hours, and then it sort of steadily declines to about 48 hours and then sharp decrease after 48 hours, right?
Yeah. So out to 48, maybe even 72 hours, it certainly plays a role. So do I think that you can get enough protein into your 4-hour feeding window to gain muscle mass as long as your stimulus is adequate? Absolutely. Do I think that is the optimal eating strategy for optimal muscle mass? No, I don't. Because we know there are these sort of like these opportunities for muscle protein synthesis. There's probably a refractory period. It's probably not as big a deal as some people think it is. You have to like exactly space out meals every 4 to 6 hours and have 40 grams per meal, and then you get this refractory period. Like you can only absorb 40 grams per meal. Like I don't think that really matters and isn't necessarily true. But I think you do create more opportunities to stimulate muscle protein synthesis with more meals. So if your goal is to generate the most muscle possible, it's probably better to eat over more than a 4-hour window. But I don't think that eating in just a 4-hour window will prevent you from gaining muscle.
Yeah. And what I usually suggest is just that. I'm like, if you're going to fast, then you're best off fasting every other day or every third day. And if you like that, and that's the way that you maintain, not going into a ridiculous surplus, because it's easy to happen, an uncontrolled bulk. I think some of us have been there, definitely. And, with that, it's definitely something like, okay, well, fasting sometimes puts the blinders on for people. So psychologically, they can stay leaner, right? It just works for them. It's like, okay, well, then you don't need to be doing it every day, because it's this thought process that more is going to be better, especially with people that are in the mindset of building muscle. It's very dangerous because they definitely end up developing a more is better mentality. It's just a lot of times naturally who they are. So yeah, exactly what you're saying. It's like, it's not as big of a concern in that 4-hour window. It's almost like, okay, well, then make sure that maybe the next day you're not fasting and you're training and you're getting enough protein within that,
I think sort of related to all of that, I think in general, it seems like, at least with early, there's a recent study just came out, randomized control trial looking at early time restricted eating versus, a wider window, but, similarly energy restricted. And what happened in the early time restricted eating group, and I think it was like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or something, they just spontaneously ate fewer calories. So they lost more weight. And I think when people put on this, I only eat from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And that's difficult for some people if they have like dinner with their family and stuff like that. But if you like create this window and you stick to that window, you will just, it seems, and there are other studies that support this by Satchin Panda as well, you'll eat less. So if your goal is to create a deficit, sometimes having those like time windows helps you do that without necessarily thinking about all the other mechanics.
Yeah, that is very true. And I'm a huge proponent of ETRF, and that's as time has gone on, I've sort of just migrated into just that lifestyle in general. It just feels better, and I seem to sleep better, and kind of goes back to what we talked about in another video. I mean, the ways that you can maximize sleep. I mean, sleep is like a performance enhancing drug in and of itself. So if you can just get yourself to optimize that, I mean, you're going to be better off than a lot of the other things anyway. Something that I've always been curious about, and you probably don't have a solid answer to it because it's one of these wild things, but okay, let's say you're fasting, you've been in extended fast, or you're even deep in ketosis. Okay, we know that ketones are largely anti-inflammatory via NLRP3 and also, nuclear factor kappa B. But now, to what extent obviously depends on the rate of ketogenesis. Would it actually be detrimental to muscle recovery by having such a massive quelling of inflammation towards the end of a workout, right? This is, I mean, I play devil's advocate with this. I'm like, this is kind of interesting, because as someone that was in deep ketosis for 3 years, never even going out of it, and in and out of ketosis for the lion's share of the last 12 years, I just think, okay, my recovery has always seemed pretty good, but I will honestly say my recovery is a little bit quicker. I'd probably, if I had to put a number on it, I'd probably say about 20% better if I do have carbohydrates that day, even if I'm not going over 50 or 60 carbs. And part of me wonders, have I been quelling that inflammatory response, or is it an advantageous effect, an additive effect of having the carbohydrates?
Yeah, that's that is a very interesting question. I think what we've kind of seen, I think from the ketone literature in general, and I don't believe there's a study that directly answers your question, but ketones seem to modulate like these pathogenic chronic inflammatory or acute inflammatory responses. And so there was this theory for a while that fasting or being on a ketogenic diet was muscle sparing, because the ketones themselves are muscle sparing. And that doesn't seem to be the case in healthy individuals. It does seem to be the case in things like cancer cachexia, where there's this chronic inflammatory process that's driving muscle wasting, and that may also be relevant to like age-related sarcopenic states, where we know that the muscle loss as you get older is due to a chronic inflammatory process. So ketones may be beneficial there. In young, healthy, fit people, I don't think ketones are like particularly muscle sparing, and I also don't think that they are going to be able to blunt the short-term inflammatory responses to exercise, as far like you get that early peak in IL-6 that then down modulates later sort of inflammatory responses. I don't think ketones are able to do that in terms of normal healthy response to exercise. I think they sort of where they kick in is in these sort of like chronic pathologic inflammatory states. That would be, if I had to pick an option, that's what I'd guess.
Yeah. It doesn't seem like, again, like I don't know to what degree the inflammation is modulated, and to what degree, obviously we do know that it's not good to take an ibuprofen or an aspirin right after a workout, right? It's like that's that. So
if you're young and healthy, if you're old, it can. Interesting.
Okay, so
that's where in older individuals, antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, in randomized trials improve muscle gain, because there's this chronic inflammatory process going on. In young people, you want that inflammation, whereas in old people, you already have too much inflammation, and then it's beneficial. So it really depends on your health status.
I learned something. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, because it's definitely an intriguing one, right? It's again, it kind of comes back to that line. It's like, okay, how much stress do you want to inflict upon yourself as well? And especially as you get older, there's things that maybe you don't want to be inflicting this stress. And it's like I mentioned before, it's like it's hard to sell insurance, right? It's very difficult to say you're young, so you can get away with this now because it's going to benefit you later. It's more so just stop thinking about it and just do it. And I usually try to bake and wrap things in my content in such a way where if I'm talking to a younger audience, I'm going to bake and wrap it in a way where I'm talking about the body composition benefits and the benefits they're going to get today, even if I know what I'm plugging for them is actually going to help them 20 years down the road. Because I just know, as someone in my 30s, even for me, it's difficult to grasp until I had kids, especially. It was hard to really think of that, right? Now I have kids, and I do think a little bit more about what's going to happen when I'm 60, what's going to happen when I'm 70, and I think about these things more. I had an interesting theory, though. This literally popped in my head yesterday, and it could be totally bass-ackwards wrong. I don't know. But, and nobody's going to know, but I'm just going to explain it because it's a chance for me to explain it. So we look at, and this is a tangent a little bit, with fasting, with keto, with carnivore, we have this physiological insulin resistance, which I hate that term too, with natural, normal thing, sparing glucose for the brain. Okay, well, then there's also evidence that, levels of insulin resistance, regardless, can be pro-inflammatory. Do you think that maybe being in a ketogenic state, having this sort of modulation of inflammation was actually this built-in mechanism to sort of counteract inflammatory responses that are coming from maybe high amounts of insulin resistance that are occurring physiologically, not good or bad, but just like a countermeasure. Because like, why would ketones be anti-inflammatory? And that's the question I always go back from an evolutionary standpoint. Why are ketones anti-inflammatory? Is it the absence of something, or is there an actual purpose?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Again, I think it's difficult I think I don't, as far as I know, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that physiologic insulin resistance in response to fasting or a ketogenic diet results in pathologic inflammation. I haven't seen that. But like, we know that, yes, if you are insulin resistant in the setting of type 2 diabetes, that's associated with high levels of inflammation. We also know that systemic inflammatory responses lead to insulin resistance. So trauma, infection causes systemic insulin resistance. And at that point, it's because you're sparing glucose for the immune system. You're basically shuttling glucose to the immune system so it can deal with whatever that insult or injury is. But I don't know I don't know why evolutionarily ketones would be anti-inflammatory. But I also haven't seen the evidence that sort of, physiologic insulin resistance is associated with elevated inflammation. But maybe that's because there are ketones kicking around and that's what balances it out. I honestly don't know.
Yeah, it's just wild. I mean, who knows, right? It's like, and then, because it's almost like the ketones aren't going to know what the person is consuming, right? Like, so there's evidence that, okay, if you consume high amounts and overeat saturated fat, that can lead to insulin resistance. But most of that is done in standard American diet. So we don't know if that's someone that's on a carnivore diet that's eating a high amount of saturated fat. Is it going to do the same thing? We don't really know, because there's the physiological insulin resistance too. So like, we can't really tell unless we were to, I mean, good luck finding that cohort, right? Like we can't so it's all just kind of like blue sky random thought territory. But I just kind of come back to this, okay, regardless of this, like, what is the purpose? Or is it just one of these things that we're just never going to know and it doesn't really matter? But it's like, if ketones are as an anti-inflammatory as they're touted to be, and they're that powerful, then what's the reason? But is it also just, has it been overhyped perhaps? I mean, and there's always that, right? Maybe it's not as big of a scale as we thought even 5 years ago.
Yeah. And, there's been a little bit of like regression to the mean in some ketone research. Like, we saw this stuff in terms of, we've talked about preventing muscle wasting, being anti-inflammatory, performance enhancement, and some of the studies that have either tried to repeat previous work or build on previous work haven't necessarily found the same effects. So, I think there is benefit from therapeutic use of ketones in multiple settings, either as a diet or exogenously. But there's been, I think, a little bit of, as we've done more work, we've realized that they're not necessarily this sort of like amazing group of compounds that can do everything like we once thought. So still a huge amount of benefit, and I'm excited in a number of arenas. But maybe some of the stuff we previously thought they did aren't really this sort of like key underlying part of their mechanism.
Yeah, it comes down to just being, like we always say, another tool in the toolbox, right?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily because it's a hormetic stressor. I mean, that is one reason, but maybe it's an exogenous tool in the toolbox. I mean, that's separate video for a different day, I suppose. But I mean, definitely some performance benefits as far as exogenous goes. But most of that research is in tandem alongside carbohydrates as well. So, and that's just because that's a non-existent natural physiological state to have insulin and ketones really present at the same time. So it's
huge energy availability. I mean, there's, for a number of reasons, both locally and centrally, sensing a large amount of energy availability is ergogenic. So if you can pour multiple different types of energy into the system and utilize them, right, that should enhance performance. But whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for your health is a very different question.
Well, it depends if you're actually going to burn it and use it, right? And even then, it's interesting. I mean, you said that so eloquently and simply and concise. And, I've had, multi-hour long conversations with Oxford University and talking about exogenous ketones. I don't think anyone's ever put it that simply. And so that was really, really well done. But well, let's wrap this one up. I know we're going to knock out some more content for people. So Tommy, where can everyone find you if they haven't seen the other videos?
Come to Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood. That's where you'll find most of my random thoughts, pictures of my dogs. And I'm fairly good at responding to DMs. So if you have any specific questions, do send them to me. I will try and get back to you if I can.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Tommy.
Thanks.